My name is Sarah. I am 32 years old, and my heart was pounding so hard against my ribs that I thought the entire dining room could hear it over the clinking of crystal glasses. I was sitting at the long mahogany table, staring down at my untouched plate, feeling a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. We were at my grandfather's estate for a family reunion, but the air was thick with 20 years of unspoken resentment. That was when my aunt, Brenda, a bitter woman of 58 years old, suddenly pushed her chair back. The harsh scraping sound echoed like a gunshot. She stood up, raising her glass with a trembling hand, her eyes locked on my mother with a toxic mixture of jealousy and triumph. The room fell dead silent as Brenda opened her mouth and said the words that would shatter the fragile peace we had maintained. She pointed a manicured finger at my mother and loudly declared that my mother was a fraud, a thief who had destroyed our family's past and had no right to sit at this table. A million questions exploded in my head. I looked at my mother, who simply lowered her eyes, ready to take the blame once again. But I could not let it happen anymore, not after carrying the crushing weight of the truth inside me for so long, and I knew right then that the explosion was going to be biblical.
To make you understand why that exact moment felt like a knife twisting in my stomach, I have to take you back to when my world first fell apart. My mother, Linda, who is now 55 years old, was always the gentle soul of our family. She was the kind of person who would give you her last dollar, even if she was starving. When I was just a little girl, our family owned a successful bakery in the heart of our small town. It was a beautiful place, always smelling of fresh cinnamon and warm bread, a place that my grandfather had built from nothing. My mother worked there every single day, waking up at 3 in the morning to prepare the dough, always with a warm smile. She loved that bakery, and she loved our family. But my Aunt Brenda was different. Brenda always hated the long hours and the flour on her clothes. She wanted the money, the status, the fancy cars, but she never wanted to put in the hard work. She would come into the bakery late in the afternoon, complain about the heat, take cash from the register for her shopping trips, and leave my mother to clean up the mess. Even as a child, I could see the unfairness of it all, but my mother never complained. She just kept working, trying to keep the peace. I used to sit on a tall wooden stool near the ovens, doing my homework, watching my mother sacrifice her youth for a business that was slowly being drained by her own sister.
Everything crashed down 20 years ago when I was only 12 years old. I remember the night so clearly because it was raining heavily, the kind of storm that makes the windows rattle. I had woken up to get a glass of water and heard muffled voices coming from the kitchen. I crept down the hallway and peeked around the corner. There was my Aunt Brenda, sobbing hysterically, her mascara running down her face, clutching my mother's hands. I had never seen Brenda look so desperate. Through her uncontrollable crying, I heard her confessing something terrible. She had been secretly taking large sums of money from the bakery's business accounts for years to fund a lavish lifestyle she could not afford, and she had gotten involved with some very bad investments. The bakery was completely bankrupt. The suppliers were demanding payment, the bank was threatening to take my grandfather's house, and the authorities were going to be involved. Brenda was begging my mother to save her. She kept saying that she would go to jail, that her life would be over, that she could not handle the shame. She pleaded with my mother to take the blame, arguing that our grandfather loved my mother more and would forgive her. I stood there in the dark hallway, my small hands pressed flat against the cold wall, feeling a deep, dark dread pooling in my stomach. What my mother did next is something that haunted me every single day of my life. Instead of kicking Brenda out, my mother pulled her sister into a hug and whispered that she would take care of it. She actually agreed to destroy her own life to save the sister who had never shown her an ounce of kindness.
The very next morning, my mother called a family meeting. I sat on the stairs, out of sight, listening as my mother stood before my grandfather and the rest of the family and lied through her teeth. She told them that she had made terrible financial decisions, that she had a gambling problem she had hidden from everyone, and that she had lost all the bakery's money. The silence that followed her confession was the heaviest thing I've ever experienced. My grandfather, a proud and strict man, wept openly. He looked at my mother with a mixture of disgust and profound disappointment. He told her she was a disgrace, that she had ruined his life's work,
and he banished her from the family business and from his house. And Brenda? Brenda just sat there, wiping away fake tears, shaking her head as if she was in shock, playing the role of the devastated sister perfectly. She didn't say a word to defend the woman who was jumping on a grenade for her. Before we left town, I confronted my mother. I was a child, but I was furious. I screamed at her, asking why she lied, telling her that I had heard everything in the kitchen the night before. My mother dropped the cardboard box she was holding, fell to her knees, and grabbed my shoulders. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she looked at me with an intensity that scared me. She made me swear, right then and there, that I would never tell a soul.
She explained that our grandfather had a weak heart, that the stress of losing the bakery was already killing him, and if he knew that his oldest daughter, Brenda, was a criminal who had stolen from him maliciously, the betrayal would literally end his life. She told me that she could survive the disgrace, but our grandfather could not survive the truth. She begged me to keep the secret for the sake of his life. It was an impossible burden to place on a 12-year-old girl. I loved my grandfather, and the thought of causing his death terrified me. So with tears streaming down my face, I nodded. I promised my mother I would keep her secret. In that moment, a heavy, suffocating chain wrapped around my chest, a chain I would drag with me for the next 2 decades. I didn't just lose my family that day, I lost my entire childhood. The years that followed were an absolute nightmare of survival. Because my mother was branded a thief and a fraud in our small town, no one would hire her. We had to move to a different city, starting over with absolutely nothing. We lived in a tiny, damp basement apartment where the heater barely worked in the winter. My mother, who used to manage a beautiful bakery, was now scrubbing floors in a hospital during the day and washing dishes in a diner at night. I watched her hands become rough and cracked, her back hunched from the endless physical labor. Every single day, I saw the physical toll the lie was taking on her. She aged 10 years in the span of 3.
And the hardest part was the holidays. We would sit alone in our cold apartment, eating cheap noodles, while we knew the rest of the family was gathered at my grandfather's large house, enjoying a feast. Sometimes my mother would look out the small basement window, lost in thought, and I knew she was missing them. I felt a boiling, toxic anger bubbling inside me. I hated Brenda with a passion that frightened me. I hated her for sleeping peacefully in her warm bed while my mother scrubbed toilets. But every time I opened my mouth to say something, my mother would give me that look, reminding me of the promise. As I grew older, this secret began to affect my own life, my friendships, and my ability to trust anyone. I became closed off, defensive, always expecting people to betray me just like Brenda had betrayed my mother. I worked hard in school because I knew education was our only way out of that basement. I got a scholarship to a good college, and I worked part-time jobs to help pay the bills. I wanted to become successful so I could give my mother the life she deserved, the life that had been stolen from her. During those college years, my mother started a small catering business from our tiny kitchen. She baked cakes and pastries using the old recipes she had memorized. Slowly, word of mouth spread. People loved her food. She worked tirelessly, turning a few orders a week into a legitimate business. I helped her with the accounting and the marketing. We were a team, fighting against the world. But the shadow of the family we left behind was always there. Sometimes a relative would reach out, usually to ask for money or to rub their supposed success in our faces. Brenda was the worst. She would occasionally send a condescending card during Christmas, bragging about her new car or her vacations, never once acknowledging the blood, sweat, and tears my mother shed. The burden of the secret became almost too much to bear when I met my husband, David, who is now 35 years old. David is a kind, patient man, a software engineer, who always saw the good in people. When we started dating, he couldn't understand why I was so fiercely protective of my mother and so hostile whenever my extended family was mentioned. I tried to keep the secret from him, believing that bringing him into the darkness would ruin our relationship. But you cannot build a marriage on a foundation of hidden trauma. One night, a few months before our wedding, I had a massive panic attack. I was sitting on the floor of my bedroom, unable to breathe, the walls closing in on me. David held me, rubbing my back, begging me to tell him what was destroying me from the inside.
And finally, the dam broke. I sat there crying uncontrollably and told him everything. I told him about the rainy night, the confession in the kitchen, the fake family meeting, and the 20 years of poverty and humiliation my mother endured to protect a sister who didn't care about her. David just sat there, completely stunned. He held my hands, his eyes wide with disbelief and anger. Having David know the truth was like taking off a heavy backpack after a 20-mile hike. Fast forward to a few weeks ago. My mother's catering business had grown into a highly successful event planning company. We were no longer struggling. We lived in a nice neighborhood. My mother had a beautiful house, and she was finally happy. But then the letter arrived. It was an elegant, thick envelope with gold lettering. My grandfather was turning 80 years old, and he was hosting a massive family reunion dinner at his estate. He wanted everyone there. He even specifically requested my mother's presence, writing a small note saying that life was too short to hold on to anger forever. When my mother read that note, she cried. She wanted to go. She wanted to see her father before it was too late. I was dead set against it. I paced around her living room, waving the invitation in the air, telling her it was a trap. I told her that Brenda would be there, and Brenda would never miss an opportunity to put her down. I begged her not to subject herself to their judgment again. But my mother was resolute. She looked at me with those calm, sad eyes and said she was going. Not for them, but for herself. She needed closure. David gently put his hand on my shoulder and told me that we had to support her. I reluctantly agreed, but I made a silent vow to myself. The days leading up to the dinner were filled with an agonizing tension. I couldn't sleep. My mind was constantly running through worst-case scenarios. What if they insulted her the moment she walked in? What if my grandfather rejected her again? I spent hours talking to David, venting my frustrations. I told him that I felt like a tightly coiled spring ready to snap. David told me to stay calm, to remember that we were only there to support my mother, and that we could leave the second things went bad. But I knew in my gut that something terrible was going to happen.
The day of the dinner, I helped my mother get ready. She wore a simple but elegant navy blue dress. She looked beautiful, dignified, and successful, a far cry from the exhausted woman scrubbing hospital floors. As I looked at her in the mirror, I felt a surge of immense pride, followed immediately by a wave of protective fury. I went to my old childhood boxes that I kept in the attic. I dug through them until I found a small, locked metal box. Inside was a piece of evidence I had secretly kept all these years. It was the original ledger from the bakery, detailing Brenda's exact illegal withdrawals. I slipped the small ledger into my designer purse, neating it there like a loaded weapon. The drive to my grandfather's estate was silent. David drove, holding my hand tightly, while my mother stared out the window, lost in memories. When we pulled up to the large iron gates, my stomach did a violent flip. The house looked exactly the same as it did 20 years ago, grand, imposing, and full of secrets. We walked up the stone steps, and the front door was opened by my cousin. The moment we stepped into the grand foyer, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Relatives who hadn't seen my mother in 2 decades stared at her with a mix of curiosity and judgment. I kept my head high, holding my mother's arm, projecting a confidence I did not feel. Then my grandfather appeared. He looked so frail, leaning heavily on a cane, his hair completely white. When he saw my mother, his eyes watered. He slowly walked over to her, and to my absolute shock, he hugged her. He whispered that he was glad she came. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought maybe this night would be okay. But then I looked across the room and saw her, Aunt Brenda. She was glaring at us, her face contorted in an ugly mask of pure hatred. Seeing my mother looking so elegant and successful was clearly driving Brenda absolutely insane with jealousy. The dinner was held in the massive formal dining room. The table was set with fine china and crystal, decorated with lavish floral arrangements. The seating arrangement felt deliberate. My grandfather sat at the head of the table. My mother, David, and I were seated near the middle, directly across from Aunt Brenda and her husband.
From the moment the first course was served, Brenda started her campaign of psychological warfare. She made loud, passive-aggressive comments about people who think they can buy their way back into a family. She bragged aggressively about her recent vacation to Europe, making sure to look directly at my mother, expecting to see the poor, defeated woman from 20 years ago. But my mother just smiled politely and ate her soup. She didn't engage. Her grace under pressure was incredible, but it only infuriated Brenda more. Brenda's voice got louder, her comments sharper. She started talking about the old days, about the bakery. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife.
David squeezed my knee under the table, silently telling me to hold on. Every time Brenda mentioned the bakery, my blood boiled. The sheer audacity of this woman, acting like a survivor of a disaster she herself had caused, was sickening. As the main course was cleared, my grandfather tapped his glass with a spoon. He wanted to make a speech. The room quieted down. He spoke in a raspy, emotional voice about his life, his regrets, and the importance of family. He looked directly at my mother and said that he had spent too many years holding on to anger, and that as he approached the end of his life, he wanted to clear the air. He announced that he was restructuring his will and that he wanted to ensure all his children, including Linda, were treated fairly and equally. The moment those words left his mouth, I saw Brenda's face turn a violent shade of red. The idea that my mother, the outcast, would get a share of the inheritance was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Brenda could not handle it. She had spent 20 years convincing everyone that she was the golden child and my mother was the villain. To see my mother welcomed back and rewarded was destroying her false reality. She started muttering under her breath, shaking her head. Her husband tried to calm her down, but she pushed his hand away. The air in the room felt electric. I knew the storm was about to hit. I slowly unclasped my purse, my fingers brushing against the cold leather of the old bakery ledger. I was ready, and that brings us back to that exact moment.
Brenda pushed her chair back, the sound scraping loudly against the floor. She stood up, swaying slightly, her eyes blazing with a jealous rage that was terrifying to witness. She pointed that manicured finger at my mother and screamed that she would not allow this, calling my mother a fraud and a thief who had no right to sit at the table. The room descended into absolute chaos. Several aunts gasped. My grandfather looked confused and pained, clutching his chest. My mother sat frozen, her face pale, the polite smile completely gone. She looked down at her plate, the old conditioning taking over. She was going to stay silent. She was going to let Brenda crucify her all over again. But then a sound came from my own throat, a low, guttural sound of pure rejection. I looked at David, who nodded firmly at me. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I didn't care about making a scene. I didn't care about the fragile peace. I looked directly into Brenda's eyes, feeling a cold, terrifying calm wash over me. I told her to shut her mouth, my voice echoing loudly in the silent dining room. Everyone turned to stare at me in shock. Brenda looked at me as if an insect had just spoken, asking how I dared to speak to her. I didn't let her finish her sentence. I reached into my purse and pulled out the old, battered leather ledger. I held it up high for everyone to see. I told them that for 20 years, I had watched my mother scrub floors, go hungry, and live in shame because she loved this family more than she loved herself. I looked right at Brenda and told her that I was awake that night, that I heard her begging my mother in the kitchen to take the fall for her massive debts and illegal withdrawals so she wouldn't go to prison.
The color drained from Brenda's face so fast she looked like a ghost. I turned to my grandfather and apologized for what I was about to do, but told him he needed to know the truth. I explained that my mother never stole a single dime, that she didn't have a gambling problem. Brenda stole the money. Brenda bankrupted the business, and my mother took the blame to protect him, knowing his heart was weak. Brenda started screaming hysterically, calling me a liar, but her voice was shrill and desperate. I walked around the table and placed the old ledger directly in front of my grandfather. I told him I found it in Brenda's desk the week we left, all in her handwriting, detailing the fake accounts and missing cash. I told him I had kept it hidden for 20 years. My grandfather slowly put on his reading glasses with trembling hands. He opened the book. The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop. We watched as his eyes scanned the pages, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. A single tear rolled down his wrinkled cheek. He looked up, bypassing me, bypassing my mother, and locked his eyes on Brenda with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. He whispered her name, his voice cracking, asking if it was true. Brenda tried to deny it, but the evidence was undeniable. She collapsed back into her chair, sobbing, but nobody rushed to comfort her. Her own husband looked at her with horror and stepped away. The illusion was shattered. My grandfather ordered Brenda and her husband to leave his house immediately and told her he never wanted to see her again. He then turned to my mother, fell to his knees right there in the dining room, and begged for her forgiveness. He wept, apologizing for not believing in her. My mother got down on the floor with him, hugged him, and told him she forgave him. Watching them hold each other, I finally felt the heavy chain around my chest snap and fall away. David wrapped his arms around me, holding me tight as I finally let out the tears I had been holding back since I was a 12-year-old girl. In the weeks that followed, my grandfather completely cut Brenda out of his will and his life. He spent his remaining time trying to make up for the lost years with my mother. Brenda's husband filed for divorce, and she was left alone, drowning in the bitterness she had created. My mother simply continued living her beautiful, successful life, but this time with her head held high, free from the heavy shadow of false guilt. Looking back on everything, I realized that keeping a secret out of love can sometimes be just as destructive as telling a lie out of malice. I sacrificed my own peace of mind to protect my grandfather, but the cost was almost too high to bear. Breaking that promise was the hardest thing I have ever done, but it was the only way to finally set us free. Sometimes the truth is a weapon, and sometimes it is a shield. That night, it was the only thing that could save my mother's honor and my own sanity.
I often wonder what would have happened if I had just kept my mouth shut at that dinner, if I had let the lie live on. Would we have survived another 20 years of silence? Would you have broken the promise and revealed the secret if you were in my place? Until the next story.